Hi there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay from SpeechKids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their little kids. And today I am delighted to have Rebecca Resnik. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
I'm going to let you do the honors. Rebecca, who are you and what do you do?
Well, Gabrielle, it occurs to me that I've been mispronouncing your name for about the past 10 years.
It's all good.
And you've been graciously never correcting me. So yes, I am Rebecca Resnik. I am a former special education teacher, and now I am a licensed psychologist, and I have a practice with 2 offices. We do psychological testing and therapy. I personally love neuropsychological testing, ages 2 through adult, and it is very much my passion, and I'm very grateful to be able to do this work and work with fun people and work with great kids and teenagers and cool people like you.
I knew there was a reason that we liked each other because of that special ed background. I'm remembering now. I love that.
Yep.
Yeah. So I asked you this before, but why do people typically come to you, and or why and or when do they come to you?
Well, the when can be, excuse me, anytime. And often people come when there's been a problem percolating literally for years. But they come to me because they're worried. They're worried about their kid. And sometimes they're worried because their parents sense that, like their spidey sense is tingling. And even though other people have told them, don't worry your pretty little head, he's just a boy, everything is fine, they just know that something is not right and they need more information. Sometimes people will have told them that something appears to be harder for their child or not progressing the way it should. And as you and I were talking before this started, I was saying that a lot of our referrals come from speech pathologists and teachers. Speech pathologists and teachers are often the very first professionals to really recognize, hey, here's what typical development looks like, here's how learning should progress, speech, reading, all of these things. And this child looks different in some way. And so those are usually the people that parents hear from.
So interesting. That very much is borne out in my experience. It feels like speech pathology is this lower entry barrier somehow, that like
it's a gateway drug.
It's a gateway drug. We're a gateway drug. I love that. The original gateway drug. Because it feels sort of like something concrete to do. Do you think that, like, what's the history of, and we just for a second, like, does the history of psychology, like that image of somebody lying on a couch telling, in psychoanalysis, is that like the thing that's preventing, like, what is that? Why?
Yeah, that's our terrible legacy. Whenever you see a psychologist on TV, they're weird and they're putting people on couches. On that show Billions, the psychologist was like getting naked with her client in a hot tub. I mean, there's a lot of weird portrayals of psychology. I think part of why speech pathology is so trusted is that the work that you all do has a great evidence base. And when you start with a speech pathologist, typically things get better, and they often get better in a fairly short amount of time. And you have this wonderful person who understands your kid, and it feels really good. For some reason, whether it's our legacy of Freud or it's our legacy of Skinner and very reductionist kind of mechanistic pure arrogance that's come out of our field, there's a huge mistrust, especially on the part of dads, about going to see anybody who's in more of the mental health sphere than the therapeutic sphere. And so a lot of times I will see kids when issues have been dragging on forever, and it's often the parent who is spending the most time in the trenches, the one who's taking the kid to the tutor, the dentist, getting the shots, arranging the play dates. That parent is still, most often the mom, or there's one of the dads or one of the moms who is kind of taking on that big role. And that parent is usually the one who is saying, we gotta do something, we need to get more information. And it's usually the parent who is not as much in the trenches who is more attending to, well, what about the stigma? And I don't want my child labeled, and I don't want some psychologist, telling me there's something wrong with my kid. So it's a big emotional barrier. And unfortunately, I think psychology needs to be doing more outreach to show people that we're actually a science, and we use evidence and research, and we can actually do something to make a child's life better instead of just sucking a whole bunch of money down into our wallets.
That's super interesting, actually, this notion that, right, the parent knows there's something wrong, the one who's the primary caregiver, and then it's sort of like from the outside, you're like, oh, hold on a second. Yeah, that's resonating for me.
Do you find that too, that there's usually one parent who is
yes,
ready
for sure
to make the jump first?
Yes, for sure. And actually I love the part of my job that one of the pieces of my job, I love my job, right?
No, you do. That's why
one of the pieces. Yeah. One of the things I love is to convince the second parent, the non-primary caregiver, usually it's the dads, not always, that what we're doing has value, that their input is actually required, not just preferred. And that working with me, that spending that money and that time is going to have a material outcome, a material effect on their daily life. Like that's the goal, right? Is like,
that's so fun, right? When you have that one parent come in, whether it's one of the moms, one of the dads, and they come in with that face like, I don't trust you, lady, this is a waste of time, and I'm here just to appease my spouse, and I'm putting up with it. And then they leave and they're like, yeah, this reminds me of when I was a kid and I had this learning problem. And you're like, yes, yes, yes.
Yes.
So you feel really good that you've at least convinced one person that your professional skills have merit and value.
Right.
I always will tell the more reluctant parent too that it is so much cheaper and faster to fix a small problem than it is to wait until it balloons. Right? Mm-hmm. It's like, it's like your roof. Fixing a little leak is much cheaper and faster than waiting for the whole roof to fall apart.
And yet, this is such a great metaphor because you don't look at the roof every day. You can't really see the roof. It's not fun to fix. It's not pretty. No. And yet it is not foundational, but whatever that's called, on top of your house.
Protective.
Say it again.
I was trying to come up with a better analogy, but I did not.
It's necessary for the functioning of your house. And that's such an interesting example. Okay. So when parents come to you, you're the diagnostician, yes?
Yeah.
They come to you, they call you, they say, my 4-year-old is having behavior problems. I don't understand what's going on. The speech therapist to the teacher said, we should see you. Mm-hmm. What happens next?
Okay. Well, the very first step in the path is I want to figure out is testing even worthwhile for this family, because there's a lot of bad information on the internet and a lot of scary information on the internet. Very well-meaning people, but well-meaning people haven't always done their homework, or maybe they just know about like their particular situation, and that has nothing to do with your situation. So the very first question I want to answer when I'm on the phone with a parent is, do they even need testing in the first place? Because I don't want to convince them to come and purchase something that is, a big investment of time and money and energy and worry, if I don't think it's going to be a slam dunk that it is really going to be what their child needs. And so oftentimes when we have that first conversation, I will be telling them something like, why don't you try a few months of therapy, see if you can get the stress level down at home, and then call me back. Or, do a few months of speech therapy, work with an expert like Gabrielle, and see what, once that person gets to know your child, then, we'll have another professional in the mix, and you'll be in a better position to decide whether or not, a speech eval is the way to go, or a full psych eval.
I didn't think we were going to go down this path, but stress is crucial in as much as managing stress levels if we've got a little person in particular, but all people, right, who is in a constant state of alarm,
Yes.
and we're going to try and, number one, we don't want to test that kid because we're not going to get anything.
Well,
Number two,
sometimes we get like, a Polaroid of,
worst case scenario.
really bad situation, and sometimes that's what we're going to get. So,
Yeah.
Waiting for things to calm down doesn't always work out in psychology, but in speech, I totally get that, because when, you're doing receptive language, if their stress level is too high for them to really pay attention to the prompts, you get junk instead of data.
That's right. That's
Sorry.
right. And no. This is exactly why we have this conversation. So my what I see a lot when families come to me, and then often if I'm doing that 6 to 8 weeks of therapy, right, and particularly with the pandemic, I've been doing screenless teletherapy, which is a little bit like bug in the ear coaching. So I'm talking to the parents through the headset, but my screen is off.
Oh gosh, that old Stanley Greenspan routine.
So amazing. And
That's
so,
cool.
yeah, it's really cool. And so what we do there is really equalizing and seeing, right, if we build connection, if we reduce frustration, if we reduce that fight, flight, or freeze response, what do we get then?
Yeah.
Right? And that after that process, and again, I'm finding it takes 6 to 8 weeks to sort of equalize that.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's like, all right, what do we have? Now are we, right?
Yes.
Okay, so back to your point about sort of you may or may not send them home, and then they call you and they say, it didn't work, he's still stressed out, we don't know what to do.
Yeah, they'll never leave empty-handed, because I know you have the same philosophy that one of the most important aspects of our job is to know who's who, and know who's good for what family, who particularly has a great talent for, say, 3-year-olds on the spectrum versus kids with intellectual disability versus those super hyperactive little guys like I had, 10 years ago. Knowing who's who, knowing who's good and ethical, who uses evidence-based practices versus who, let's just say, doesn't, or makes it up as they go along. Sometimes I think that's a huge part of our jobs, because we are in the community instead of being like in a hospital, clinic, or school. The concierge piece, if you will, side of our practice, like connecting them up with the best of the best, is a huge value add of what we do. And so it is part of our job to go out to lunch with people and have coffee and get to know people. So after we get to that first decision point, do we think testing is the way to go? Then the question becomes, do I have a staff member in my practice? Do I have a psychologist or a neuropsychologist who is the right fit? If I don't, I'll refer them out. My father was a dentist in private practice. He always said, when in doubt, refer them out. And I think that's the best advice ever. You want that family to come away feeling like you cared much more about their child getting what they needed than, your bottom line. And I think that's like a long-term growth strategy, as well as the right thing to do.
100%. And we do the same thing. I am always happy if we can't serve you, we will send you to the person we think will do the best job. That it's a huge deal. It really is.
It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. And that's exactly what you want. And part of why in this market space, I really like collaborating with a lot of women, people who identify as women in the market space, because the women tend to have that tend and befriend model of collaborating with other professionals, as opposed to the compete and defeat mentality.
I like those.
Oh, rhymes are great.
Yeah.
So if I have someone in my practice who has the right skill set, and most importantly can see them in the time frame that they need, because a lot of families, they're on the fence for a long time. They're really hoping that something will happen to make things better. So maybe, the new teacher this year, the new school, the new, tutor, the new speech path, the new OT, the new whatever it is, the new classes. They're always hoping that something's going to fix it because it's their kid. And oftentimes they're coming to see me when they have exhausted every other option, from like aromatherapy to, vitamins to girls on the run to like anything they can think of. So oftentimes they've waited a really long time, and so they have a deadline looming of some kind. When you're talking about going to a psychologist for testing in particular, plan way ahead, because anybody who's good is busy. And particularly during this time of COVID, when a lot of older psychologists had to stop testing, or people who had medical conditions, schools are backlogged, people who shut down during the pandemic are backlogged. If you've got a pulse, you're probably busy. Never mind being good. The really good people are booked way out. So do not wait until like 2 weeks before you need your testing to start calling a psychologist. Start calling months in advance, particularly if you're talking about getting testing for private school admissions. You really want to get that lined up in September or October. If you wait until November, nobody good is going to be able to take you.
Which is fine.
Maybe.
Your child is typically developing and doesn't need, a particular cocktail of investigation.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. If you can do a run-of-the-mill kind of thing, again, the best people are full. Okay, you go to the next tier. It's fine.
A lot of times, yeah, but I'll push back a little bit on that, because if you have a kid who's not particularly atypical, or there's a fairly simple matter going on, then you can get your testing for free through the county.
Yeah.
And for a lot of kids, that is just fine. Get it for free. It's when you have a kid who's somehow more complicated. Maybe they're gifted, maybe they're on the spectrum, maybe they have a rare genetic anomaly. I love seeing kids with rare genetic differences. It's so exciting to get to know them and figure out, how their little minds work. Maybe you have a particularly anxious kid who's going to need to be tested in really short sessions, or a kid with a chronic illness. So you need somebody who really understands how to make that child comfortable. I think you and I have both trained in hospitals. Am I right?
I had a brief moment, so I wouldn't say that, but you have.
I have. And when you train in a hospital, you get to the point where, anybody who comes in the door, if they can't move their body at all, versus if they can't speak, versus if the only way they can signal their response. I had one girl who could raise her arm like that, and we tested her the whole way through. She would raise her arm in response to the answer she wanted to give, and she, gosh darn it, we found out she had average intelligence, which nobody had ever known before. That was really exciting. So I got off into memory lane there, and I think I forgot what question you asked me, actually.
I think I forgot too, and it doesn't matter.
Edit that out.
Oh, in terms of seeing, sort of the difference between, and this is a point I wanted to make earlier as well, which is this notion of, child development. And I try to say this as often as possible to whoever will listen. Child development, when it's going right, looks really easy.
Yeah.
It looks
beautiful way to say it.
Effortless. It looks synchronized. It's symphonic, right? And when it's not, you realize that, oh God, the violins are out of tune and the drum is not beating at the right pace. And this is all kind of falling apart. They're still playing the tune, but it doesn't look quite right. It looks difficult. It looks effortful. And it's not until that happens that, number one, you realize, oh my God, this is really complicated, which is why, 20 years in, we're both still doing our jobs, because it's really complicated.
Yeah, and I think both of us love complicated.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Yeah.
But that one little piece of like, wow, this looks a lot harder than it should be. That's the parent signal. That's your signal.
That's a great one.
To like go for it and start digging and ask the people in your circle. Not the ones who tell you, oh, he's just a boy, he'll be fine. The ones who say, let's take a closer look at that.
Uh-huh.
But when you have a child for whom, you know, development is effortless, you're going to pay less attention to that kind of stuff because the stakes aren't as high. Things are going
you feel
well.
like the most amazing parent ever.
Say it again.
You feel like the most amazing parent ever. You know, he talks so early. He eats vegetables. I'm so awesome.
And yeah, no, you don't ever really know what kind of parent you are until you've got a child who taxes you.
My stepson just turned 28, and you know, so I've been all the way around the horn in terms of, you know, raising him. On my third sort of borderline teenager now, and they all, you know, provided me with my share of gray hairs and sleepless nights, and none of them had a lot of huge issues. But yeah, when you find that that other kids your child's age are doing things that your child's not yet, or looking somehow different, and you know, again, that's usually the teacher who's the first to see it, especially with your first baby. You know, with your first baby, you're so exhausted, you're so overwhelmed, you're learning it as you go, you know, you're literally building the house while you're living in it, and it's really hard when you're that close and emotionally involved with your child to sort of know, well, when should they be doing this? You know, the books give you a guideline, but you know, it's really hard to know, is development actually unfolding the way it should? Like, one of my examples, and I know this is one that you probably talk about too, is when you go to the pediatrician with your child, and they're there, you know, they're typing on their computer, and your kid is maybe screaming or crying or breaking things or leaping off the table. That was my experience. And the pediatrician is asking you, you know, these questions, kind of mumbling like, is he talking? Well, is he talking? That's a huge question. That's like a 20-minute at least, you know, conversation. And you know, most parents will say like, yes. And you know, when you have a kid who maybe is saying things, but maybe they're just like reciting scripts from their favorite TV show. Like if they can recite an entire episode of Thomas the Tank Engine or Doc McStuffins or Bubble Guppies, or you know, the pediatrician will hear, yes, they're talking, and check it off in their little electronic medical record. And so you've just missed like 6 months worth of opportunity to intervene, because that pediatrician was too busy to, you know, really ask you the kind of questions that they needed to. And so sometimes parents will, you know, kind of roll the dice, and you know, they'll think, well, you know, the pediatrician didn't see anything wrong, so things are probably fine, right? I sense you're bursting. You should talk.
No, I have, you know, and it is never my intent to diss pediatricians, because they are the front line of medical care for our children. They don't have the time, nor do they have the equipment, you know, sort of knowledge to screen for developmental delays. And I feel like given the increase that we're seeing in developmental delays, particularly autism spectrum disorder, I feel like that's changing, number one, but it's not coming fast enough. And so to your point, you know, are they talking? And the answer is yes. And in the subtitle is, they said mama last week one time.
Yeah.
Right. Or they quote from Doc McStuffins. Those are qualitatively really different from, oh my gosh, we can't get him to shut up. He points at things all the time and looks at me to tell him what it is.
Or he talks at home, but when he goes out into school, he's not talking to other children. He's not interacting. And I know we're using he a lot. I happen to have 3 boys, so he is kind of the pronoun that pops into my mind first. So I don't mean to be sexist. That's just what I happen to have on tap at home.
Well, and it's funny, for a long time, many of my clients were boys. And that is no longer the case. I have 50-50 now. And
that's great.
Yeah, in the past, I would say 5 to 10 years, that's been the case. But the first 10 years of my caseload, like, you know, I worked at Ivy Mount School for a long time. Yeah. Like 80% of my caseload was boys.
Yeah, when I taught special ed, it was too. And what they taught us was that the biggest factor in determining who gets referred for special education services was disruptive behavior. And so, you know, just boys tend to act in ways that people notice. Dr. Sam Goldstein, one of the autism resilience experts, he talks about how a kid has to bother people for like at least 3 weeks across 3 settings, at least 3 people. He talks about like the rule of 3 for them to get noticed and sent over. Well, if you happen to have a girl who is manifesting symptoms that aren't particularly troubling to other people or don't bother people or get in the way, she's very likely to get passed over. And boys who tend to be internalizers, that happens as well.
Right. That's so interesting. It wasn't until, we know that we gender stereotype our children academically. It wasn't until a really close friend of mine, I can't remember how old her child was at the time, decided that they were trans. And that they had been gender assigned a male at birth, but they were a girl. And it wasn't until then, when I was interacting with this child, that I realized how gendered my interactions are with all children. It's really not until, and this is not a conversation about trans children, but it is a conversation about what we do and don't notice about when children are interacting with us, and what we expect, and are we aware of those implicit biases, right? And like how that affects what we either diagnose or don't diagnose.
No, it's so true. There's a bit of wisdom from the Jewish holy book, the Talmud, and it says, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so our brains are just primed to see what we expect to see. And so if we are, nobody expects, unless you've had some prenatal testing that alerted you that something was different. We all expect our children to be typical and neurotypical, not too short, not too tall, not too fat, not too thin, good at sports, but maybe not amazing. We have sort of a preconceived notion of like what our children are going to be, and they're never like that. So it's like, it's like the box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
And it's interesting, and we'll wrap it up on that note, because by and large, the chocolates in the box are pretty tasty, and they're not all smushed, right? I don't know where I'm going with this metaphor. My point is, even in their difference, most children don't need us. The vast majority of the children in the world do not need a speech therapist, nor do they need a psychologist.
Right. It's not, it's not like everybody just needs to,
There are some who do, and the way you tell if that's the case is, again, that like, it looks too hard. It's really different, right? And that's where you just want to keep looking. And, I like to think that this conversation has maybe lowered the barrier a little bit for people to seek your services.
But I hope so for you too, because we, when we first start contemplating is something, the word always comes like, is something wrong with my child? That is such a scary, and speaking here as a parent as well as a practitioner, it's terrifying to imagine that. And particularly if you come from a culture where there's an intense stigma or shame around a child having any kind of difference or disability, it's even harder. But it's really important if you get any kind of information, or if your spidey sense is tingling and it seems like something's off, get on the phone or get in front of somebody who knows childhood development, who's not your friend, not your mother-in-law, especially not your mother-in-law. You're somebody who can be really objective and professional, who's seen thousands of kids, who has those gray hairs and crow's feet. Look for the crow's feet. Those people who can objectively tell you in a very honest and professional way, does your child need any kind of extra help? Getting the extra help earlier is always better. You do not want for things to snowball, particularly during those early years of elementary school, when the academics come fast and furious, especially in our area where kids are expected to be reading pretty much by the time they're in the middle of kindergarten, and writing sentences by the time they're at the end of kindergarten.
And that's a whole other conversation that we could absolutely have sometime.
It is relentless how fast that curriculum moves.
Yep.
And you do not want to wait until your child is, say, a year behind before you start trying to help them catch up. Because then not only do you have to catch up with a full year backlog of learning and feeling good about themselves, you got to get up with the peers who are still running.
Yep.
So getting in front of a professional that you feel like you can trust sooner rather than later is like the best piece of advice that we can both give.
Yeah. Where can people find out more about you, Rebecca?
My website is the best way to do that. So it's www.resnikpsychology.com. And Resnik is spelled R-E-S-N-I-K. I always say if it's a C, it's not me.
Oh my gosh,
my
I think
Jewish
I've been
friends,
misspelling your name forever too.
oh my, everybody does. It's one of those Eastern European Jewish names that got mangled in Ellis Island, and so there's a million ways to spell it, but I am N-I-K like Nudnik is the joke I make for my Jewish friends. So yeah, it's Resnik Psychology, and you can write to me, and we can see if we have something that might be of use to you, and if not, I will definitely connect you up with other great people who can give you the answers you need.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. It was a treat.
This was fun. Nice change of pace.
Yay.
Yay.
Take care.